This may go down as one of the most important weeks of the year. Not because of one headline, but because of what all of them are pointing to. The US Supreme Court just wrapped up one of the most consequential terms in years. A new Dallas Fed housing study is already fueling political reaction. Texas leaders are suddenly talking much more aggressively about who should pay for AI infrastructure. And when you zoom out, all of these stories are really about the same thing. The rules are changing. The legal rules, the housing rules, the technology rules, and the economic rules. The question is not whether change is happening. The question is whether we understand it early enough to adapt. I'm Kyle Grimshaw, and this is the Texas Market Brief. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Kyle Grimshaw with the Grimshaw Home Group. Today is Wednesday, July 1st, 2026. If you're a homeowner, investor, entrepreneur, or just someone trying to make sense of where Texas and America are headed, you're in the right place. And today's episode is especially important because this is one of the most important moments where several major stories are colliding at the same time. We've got a Supreme Court term ending with major implications for privacy, executive power, and the role of government. We've got a Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas working paper reigniting debate over what's really driving housing affordability. And we've got Texas moving deeper into real-world test of what happens when AI growth collides with power, water, zoning, and local communities. So today is not about taking sides, it's about reading the landscape clearly. Because whether you work in real estate or not, these shifts eventually reach your neighborhood, your bills, your business, and your opportunities. Let's get into it. Supreme Court officially wrapped up its term this week. And like most Supreme Court terms, there were a lot of decisions. But not all rulings matter equally in everyday life. Some decisions are technical, some are narrow, and some quietly reshape the framework everyone else has to operate inside. That's the category we're talking about today. Now, rather than trying to cover every major case from the term, I want to focus on the bigger takeaway. The court continues to play a major role in defining the limits of government power. What can agencies do? What can the executive branch do? What authority belongs to the states? And what rights still follow the individual into the digital age? That last question matters more than a lot of people realize, because one of the most interesting rulings at the end of this term involves cell phone location data. In Chattree versus United States, the court ruled 6-3 that when law enforcement obtained Google location history through a geofence demand, that was a search under the Fourth Amendment. That matters. Because in plain English, the court is saying detailed location data tied to your phone is not some meaningless digital byproduct. It touches a real privacy interest. Now, here's the important nuance. The court did not simply issue a one-line national rule that answers every future location data case forever. It sent the case back down for the lower court to decide whether the specific search in that case was constitutionally reasonable. But the signal is still clear. The court is still continuing to define how old constitutional protections apply to modern digital age. And that matters in Texas too. Because whether we're talking about privacy, property rights, business regulation, or federal authority, these rulings shape the playing field underneath everything else. You'll hear people say, the court ruled, but it's worth slowing down and asking what that actually means. The Supreme Court does not write laws. Congress does. The president signs or vetoes them. State legislatures pass state laws. What the Supreme Court does is interpret the Constitution and decide whether government action fits within it. That sounds abstract, but it's not abstract at all. Because once the court defines a constitutional boundary, that interpretation affects how agencies operate, how states legislate, and how police investigate, and how businesses comply. Also, how citizens challenge power. That means a court decision can eventually influence how private your data really is, how much power federal agencies can exercise, how immigration policy is enforced, how elections are administered, and how quickly entire industries can be regulated or challenged. So even if you never read a court opinions still shape the country you live in. That's why I think this matters. Not because legal commentary is exciting for its own sake, but because it tells you where the rulebook is being rewritten. Now, let's move to housing, because this next story is one of the clearest examples of how quickly research can become policy fuel. A recent Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas working paper examined the effects of unauthorized immigrant worker flows on local labor and housing markets between 2021 and 2024. And the reason it's getting so much attention is simple. It puts numbers on something that has been politically explosive for a long time. The paper found that when unauthorized immigrant worker flows rose by an amount equal to 1% of a local area's initial employment, local house prices increased about 2.2% and rents increased about 1.4% during that boom period. The authors also estimated that in the average local market they studied, these flows could explain about 30% of total house price growth and 20% of rent growth during that same period. That is a significant finding, but this is where I want to be very careful. That does not mean immigration is the only reason housing got more expensive. It doesn't even mean it was the dominant factor everywhere. And it definitely does not erase the rest of the affordability story, because housing affordability is still being shaped by a whole system. Mortgage rates, construction costs, insurance, property taxes, zoning, infrastructure, labor shortages in the trades, permitting delays, the list goes on. And the basic fact that in many markets, supply was too tight. In fact, one of the most important findings in the paper is that housing supply did not expand meaningfully enough in response. That's the real choke point. Demand hit a market where supply was slow, limited, and expensive to add. So to me, the deeper lesson is not simply, look at this one demand factor. The deeper lesson is that when housing supply stays rigid, almost any serious demand shock becomes painful. And that's exactly what Texans need to keep understanding. Because if we want lower costs, the long-term answer is still more functional supply. That means more homes, faster permitting, smarter zoning, more infrastructure, more trade labor, and a system where building can actually keep up with growth. If your goal is housing affordability, there are only a few levers that really matter over time. You can reduce demand, you can increase supply, or you can pretend price pressure is going to disappear on its own. And that last one is not a strategy. This is also why political reaction matters, because almost immediately, this paper started showing up in arguments for new housing related restrictions and new eligibility debates. That doesn't mean those proposals become law. It means the conversation has already moved from research to legislation. And that's another version of the same theme from today's episode. The rules are changing in real time, not 5 years from now, right now. Now let's talk about AI, because for the last year, a lot of AI conversation has been theoretical. What will it do to jobs? What will it do to search? What will it do to education? Those questions still matter. But in Texas, the conversation is becoming much more physical. Now the questions are, who pays for power? Who pays for the transmission? Who bears the water burden? Who gets the tax breaks? Who gets to say when large-scale AI infrastructure moves into the community? That shift is very important, because it means AI is no longer just a software story. It's now a land use story, an infrastructure story, public utility, and local government story. According to the Texas Tribune, earlier this month, Governor Greg Abbott directed the Public Utility Commission of Texas and ERCOT to make sure the data center development does not shift electric infrastructure costs onto residential ratepayers. He also called for policies that would require data centers to pay for their own infrastructure, add electric capacity instead of just demand, and use water-efficient systems, report energy and water usage, and reduce neighborhood impacts. Then, this week, Abbott went further in public comments, calling for blocking new AI data center development in rural Texas neighborhoods unless those projects bring their own money, bring their own power, reuse their own water, and stop pushing costs onto Texas families. That is a major shift in tone, and it tells you something important. Texas is not backing away from growth, but Texas is beginning to ask harder questions about the terms of growth. That's a different conversation, and honestly, it's a more mature one. because it recognizes that economic development is not free. A giant data center might mean jobs, investment, and tax base, but it also means that transmission upgrades, local opposition, water demand, noise concerns, land use conflict, and the pressure on the grid is all increasing. That's not anti-growth, that's the reality of growth. Texas is where all of these stories meet. That's why I think this episode matters so much. Texas is a fast growth state. It's a housing state, it's an infrastructure state. Texas is becoming an AI infrastructure state. And because of that, we're getting an early preview of what the next decade may look like for the rest of the country. Here's what I mean. When the Supreme Court redefines privacy or the limits of government power, those rulings affect Texans. When a Dallas Fed paper reframes part of the housing conversation, that affects Texans. When AI growth demands more power, more land, more cooling, more transmission, and more political accountability, that affects Texans. We are living at the intersection of law, growth, and infrastructure. And that intersection is going to define a lot of winners and losers over the next decade. The next phase of Texas growth cannot be just about how fast we expand. It has to be about whether the systems underneath expansion actually work. Do we have enough housing supply? Do we have enough water? Do we have enough electric capacity? Do we have enough trained workers? Do we have local processes strong enough to handle industrial scale development without simply pushing costs downstream? Those are the real questions. Because if the rules are changing, then execution becomes everything. Here's my take. I think the biggest mistake people make is treating these stories like they're unrelated. They're not. The Supreme Court story is about the boundaries of institutional power. The housing story is about what happens when demand meets constrained supply. The AI story is about whether innovation can scale without overwhelming the systems underneath it. Different headlines, same core issue. How do we govern change? That's the real question. How do we govern growth? How do we govern technology? How do we govern markets moving faster than policy? And how do we do it without breaking affordability, privacy, or trust? Because if you really zoom out, that's what this episode is about. Not politics for the sake of politics, not outrage for the sake of outrage, but the way the systems change. And I think the people who do best over the next decade will be the ones who stop looking at headlines in isolation and start asking a better question. What rule is being rewritten here? Because once you understand that, you're no longer just reacting, you're anticipating. And in markets, in business, and in life, that matters. I want to hear from you. Which set of rules do you think is changing the fastest right now? The legal system, the housing system, the technology system, or the financial system? Leave a comment below and tell me why. I'd genuinely love to hear your perspective. Now, if you found today's episode helpful, make sure to subscribe. And if there's a topic that you want me to break down in a future episode of the Texas Market Brief, let me know in the comments. I'm Kyle Grimshaw with the Grimshaw Home Group. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. Have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you on Friday.